Good morning. My name is Wally Kelly, and I'm the Health Center Chaplain here at the Moorings. I welcome you this morning to Chaplain's Corner, April 16th, 2022. You remember the story in Genesis about the Tower of Babel? I think it's in the 11th chapter of Genesis. According to the story, a united human race in the generations following the Great Flood, speaking a single language and migrating eastward, comes to the land of Shinar. There they agree to build a city and a tower tall enough to reach heaven. God, observing their city and tower, so the story goes, confounds their speech so they can no longer understand each other and scatters them around the world. Russell Moore is the public theologian for Christianity Today magazine. If you're wondering what a public theologian is, I also wondered about that. So I do what many of us do these days when we don't know something. I Googled it. And public theology is the Christian engagement and dialogue within the church, and especially within the larger society. Basically, he writes a column dealing with Christianity and our culture. And his most recent column I enjoyed very much. He referenced a piece written by moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt, which he wrote for The Atlantic magazine. And I want to share with you what I got out of that article. Haidt writes that we are all now living on the other side of the Tower of Babel. It's interesting to me that Haidt, an atheist, would reference a story from the Bible. It's interesting because he seems to get to the point of the story better than religious people do. Of course, he doesn't literally mean we are living on the other side of the Tower of Babel. He's using the story as a metaphor that points to America's fracturing into culturally tribal factions, which he argues reached its tipping point in 2009 when some very technologically savvy things happened. Facebook pioneered the like button. And if you're not familiar with the like button, if someone posts something on Facebook and you like it, you just press the button. And so there's kind of a competition among people on Facebook to see who can get the most likes. And then Twitter added a retweet function. I think probably everybody's familiar with tweets because of a certain politician who made that his main way of connecting with certain segments of the populace. Culture wars have been going on for a long time, but they really accelerated in the 1960s and especially the 1970s. How many of you remember the moral majority? Founded, I think, by Jerry Falwell Sr. And that was really an outcome of the culture wars. But technological developments like Facebook and Twitter have accelerated this. They've encouraged triviality and mob mentality and generates outrage in ways that we've never seen before. For Haidt, this descent into Babel means not a new culture war, but a different kind of culture war, where the target is not people on the other side so much as those on one's own side who express any sympathy whatsoever for the other side's viewpoints or even their humanity. Talk radio made this really a popular thing among people that listen to that. They tolerate no dissent. Political or cultural or religious extremists whose goal is to produce viral content, things that'll stir things up and travel around the world, which they use the term, it's his comment went viral or his video went viral. They target dissenters or nuanced thinkers on their own team, making sure that democratic institutions based on compromise and consensus grind to a halt. At the same time, Haidt contends, this sort of outrage-fueled, enhanced virality explains why our institutions are what he calls stupider en masse. It's his term. Because social media installed in their members a chronic fear of getting targeted, leaving the discourse controlled by a tiny minority of extremist trolls, all looking for traitors or Karens, if you heard that term. And if your name is Karen, I'm sorry that people have picked up that name and used it in a derogatory way. Heretics, they call people heretics. It's hard to be in the middle these days. Moderates rarely win in either political party in a national election because they have to go through the extremists to get their party's nomination. Moore argues that Haidt's metaphor might be even more on point than he knows. Babel, after all, was not just a technological achievement leading to fragmentation and confusion. Babel was rooted in two driving forces, which are also behind the outrage culture that we are submerged in right now. One of these is the desire for personal glory and fame. In Genesis 11:4, the people building the tower said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves." On any given day, you can see this dynamic at work in people who think the only way to build their personal brand is to attack someone or say something outrageous enough to draw mobs of supporters and dissenters. The other driving force is the desire for self-protection. The tower was necessary, the builders said, because otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. So the technology they were using was needed to forestall an existential threat. So what should a Christian posture be in this post-Babel world? James Davison Hunter warned over a decade ago that much of American religious culture war engagement was based in a heightened sense of resentiment, which I think that's a term that he coined, or a word that he coined, which he said went beyond resentment to include a combination of anger, envy, hate, rage, and revenge. In resentiment, a sense of injury and anxiety becomes key to the group's identity. Often, this sort of anxiety-fueled rage and revenge is bound up not with a fear of specific policy outcomes, but with a more primal fear, more akin to middle school, the fear of humiliation. It feels like a kind of death, the kind that leaves one exposed and ridiculed by the outside world. In Hunter's view, a resentiment posture is heightened to when the group holds a sense of entitlement to greater respect, greater power, to a place of majority status. This posture, he warned, is a political psychology that expresses itself with the condemnation and denigration of enemies in the effort to subjugate and dominate those who are culpable. Often, whether it's immigrant caravans overwhelming the border, the concept of American elites developing a global pandemic to control the population with vaccines, or the conspiracy theories that there are Satan-worshiping pedophile rings at the highest levels of government. The most contentious aspects of American life for these people center on the question, who is trying to take America away from us? In her book, High Conflict, Amanda Ripley writes that humiliation happens whenever our brains have conducted a rapid-fire evaluation of events and fit it into our understanding of the world. But that's not enough. She argues to be brought low, we have to first see ourselves as belonging up high. To illustrate this, she points to a golf outing, the only one that she's ever been in which she missed the ball over and over again. She laughed at herself, she said, but she didn't feel humiliated because being good at golf had never been part of her identity. However, if a professional golfer did the same thing, he or she would likely feel humiliated, especially if the misses were caught on camera in front of a wide television audience. Yet the cross is quite different. Fleming Rutledge writes in her book, The Crucifixion, the Roman Empire could not have chosen a worse means to signify humiliation and domination than to crucify those who stood against their rule. A cross did not just end a life, it did so in the most ridiculing way possible, magnifying Caesar's domination over the one gasping for air on a stake. With Roman soldiers standing around and crowds screaming in rage and laughter, Good Friday looked like the triumph of Babel, right down to the signs in multiple languages over the head of the crucified king. And yet Jesus spoke of this downward trajectory as the way in which he would be lifted up and would draw all people to himself. This stands in contrast not only to those who would seek to magnify themselves, such as Caesar, who wanted no rivals to his reign, but also to those who would seek their own self-protection, such as the disciples who fled in fear. Only the crucified Christ, the sin-bearing Lamb of God, vindicated by the resurrecting power of his Father, could pour out the Spirit in a way that could reverse Babel at Pentecost. But the resurrection and ascension were not an undoing of the crucifixion. They were instead a continuation of what Jesus announced to be already a triumph through defeat, a power through weakness. I found something, I read something very interesting. A New Testament scholar, Richard Hayes, once made the observation that after Jesus' resurrection, he didn't appear to Pilate or to Caesar or to Herod. To do so would have been to vindicate himself, to win an argument, rather than to save a world. Instead, as Luke puts it, Jesus presented himself alive to those he had chosen as witnesses. That's because Jesus' kingdom would advance not through resentment and grievance, but through those who bore witness to him with sincerity and truth, even to the loss of their own lives. Conquering like that, through the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, is what winning looks like when one sees who the enemy actually is. You know, experts tell us to expect the next few years to be worse than the previous ones in terms of dysfunction and culture wars and all the nastiness that's been going on. Those who seek to make a name for themselves by exploiting fear and outrage will continue to get better at it. Technology helps them get better at it and makes it easy for them to do that. And they will not lack for an audience that will believe the only thing standing between them and annihilation is the requisite amount of theatrical anger. Mr. Moore makes this observation about the situation that we face in America today. Culture wars can fuel ratings and clicks and fundraising appeals, but they cannot reconcile sinners to a holy God. They cannot reunite a fragmented people, and they can't, even in the long run, make us less afraid. As Christians, Good Friday should remind us that adding more outrage and anger to an exhausted culture is not how God defines his wisdom and power. Babel building can't help us. Only cross-carrying can. Let me pray. Gracious God, you have shown us through the modeling of Jesus how we are called to relate to persons that are culturally different than us, that see the world different than we do. Help us to be peacemakers in our culture. We ask you, God, to open our minds and hearts to the challenge and invitation to model your perfect example of love. Amen. Have a wonderful day and a blessed Easter.